Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'll be talking about Pinghua. And actually, please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions at any time. And I'll be mainly talking about the affiliation of Pinghua because there's been lots of arguments and debates over the affiliation of Pinghua. Some people said that Pinghua is Yue, and some people said that Pinghua is not Yue. This talk is based on bits and pieces from some forthcoming publications. The structure of the language structure of Pinghua itself is actually not very complicated. However, everything else that has to do with Pinghua is very complicated. So in this talk, there will be some level of simplification. First of all, the Sinitic languages or Chinese dialects are commonly divided into dialect groups. And the classification of these have evolved over the ages. For instance, there is Zhan Bohui's 7 groups. There are Mandarin, Wu, Gan, Xiang, Min, Hakka, and Yue. This classification of 7 groups is very famous and it functions. There is also the first edition of the Language Atlas of China, which has 10 groups. So there are the traditional 7 groups and 3 more, and they are Hui, Jin, and Pinghua, plus other small unclassified varieties. So Pinghua. Before that point, not many people knew what Pinghua was. And actually, even nowadays, not many people know what Pinghua is. So the question is, what is Pinghua? A related question is that because Pinghua is very commonly discussed together with Yue, so a related question is, what is Yue? Yu Hai Mat? And before I talk about anything else, I have to talk about the idea of Pinghua as an endonym versus the idea of Pinghua as a linguistic concept. In other words, what the speakers themselves call Pinghua versus what linguists call Pinghua. First of all, the name Pinghua itself, it just means flat language. Okay, by extension, flat means simple, ordinary, straightforward. So Pinghua, flat language, is the language of the ordinary people. The term Pinghua is used in opposition with Guanhua, which is Mandarin, which is the language of the mandarins, the officials. And as you can imagine, with such a simple name, there are many different peoples around the world which calls the language flat language. Within China, there is the example of Eastern Min that also calls themselves Pinghua. And outside of China, for instance, you have Low German that also calls themselves platt, flat. So you have to be very careful with speech varieties which are called Pinghua by the speakers, and speech varieties that are called Pinghua by linguists. And these two concepts only overlap partially. I'll give you just 2 examples. The first example is in Ningyuan County in southern Hunan. In Ningyuan County, there are 3 types of Chinese dialects. There is Ningyuan Pinghua, which is the majority language. There is Ningyuan Guanhua, which is southwestern Mandarin, and it is the socially dominant language in Ningyuan. And there's also Ningyuan Tuhua, which is the unclassified Chinese dialects related to the neighboring counties. As for Ningyuan Pinghua, Li Lianjin considers Ningyuan Pinghua Pinghua. However, Li Yongxin and Li Cuiyun considers Ningyuan Pinghua as Gan. And from my point of view, I think that Ningyuan Pinghua is neither Pinghua or Gan, because historically, Ningyuan Pinghua was most probably related to both Pinghua and Gan, but synchronically, I think it is a bit far-fetched to consider Ningyuan Pinghua either Pinghua or Gan. So the point here is really that what the speakers call Pinghua is not necessarily what linguists consider Pinghua. 那就是画者认为是平话的东西呢，就不一定是语言学家认为是平话的东西，所以你要非常的小心。In the opposite direction, 反过来呢 there's 梨塘客话 which is spoken in Pingyang County in central Guangxi, Pingyang to the northeast of Nanning. 梨塘客话 so you hear 客话 you have to be very careful because 客话 is not Hakka. 客话 is very clearly not Hakka. 客话 is Pinghua. Now, the reason is that the Pinghua people in Binyang, they call themselves Kehua, Ke, guest, because they are the guests in relation to the native people. On the other hand, in Binyang, you also have Hakka spoken there, but Hakka is called Xinminhua, new folk language, because these are the languages spoken by people who arrived even later. So the point here is that what linguists call Pinghua is not necessarily called Pinghua by the speakers. Okay? This is another thing that you have to be very careful about. So from this point onward, I'm only talking about what linguists call Pinghua. So Pinghua is primarily spoken in Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region in far southern China. In the vicinity, you have Beihuan, Gulf of Tonkin, you have Vietnam, and also the Chinese provinces of Yunnan, Guizhou, Hunan, and Guangdong. And Guangxi, the capital and also the largest city, is Nanning, here in central southern Guangxi. And the next two largest cities are Liuzhou and Guilin. Guilin is quite famous as a tourist attraction, but actually the entire Guangxi is quite beautiful in its own way. In terms of before that, the term Pinghua is used as an endonym around Nanning and Guilin. In terms of officially recognized ethnicity, 31% of people are Zhuang, and more in the West. Zhuang are the native people. And 62% is Han, more in the East. 14 million speakers speak Zhuang languages. The Zhuang languages belong to the Dai family. So they are the relatives of Thai and Lao, for instance. And there are 33 million Sinitic speakers. More in the West, more in the East. This is a map of the Sinitic languages in Guangxi, okay, coming from the language atlas of China. This bluish language is Pinghua, in here and here and here. There are 4.13 million speakers, which is not a very big language. Pinghua is not big. Pinghua is commonly divided into Northern Pinghua and Southern Pinghua, Guibei Pinghua, Guinan Pinghua. Northern Pinghua is spoken in this northeastern region of Guangxi in Guilin and Hezhou prefectures, whereas the rest of the Pinghua dialects are Southern Pinghua, including these Pinghua dialects in the north, in Liuzhou and Heqi prefectures. Some linguists divide Northern and Southern Pinghua differently. Some linguists consider these Pinghua dialects in the Northern Pinghua as well, but we will stick with the classification as in the language atlas of China. Pinghua represents the earliest Han Chinese migrants in Guangxi, so Pinghua is the oldest Chinese dialect in Guangxi. However, as you can see from this very small figure, that Pinghua has been overtaken by 3 other groups of later migrants into Guangxi. The first is this red language, Yue. There are 16.86 million Yue speakers in Guangxi. And the Yue dialects in Guangxi can be divided into, broadly divided into 2 types, non-Cantonese and the Cantonese dialects. The non-Cantonese dialects, these big ones in the east and south, they were spread from Guangdong in the east gradually in the last, 400 or 500 years, very gradually. On the other hand, these red blobs here, and there are also some blobs in the east as well. These blobs, these are the Cantonese dialects. These people, they moved directly from the Pearl River Delta directly to Guangxi within the last, most of them within the last 150 years or so. So these Cantonese dialects are obviously Cantonese. So they're non-standard. People speaking standard Cantonese understand these Cantonese dialects, but they are very slightly influenced by the local languages. On the other hand, the non-Cantonese dialects, people speaking standard Cantonese would have trouble understanding these non-standard, these are non-Cantonese Yue dialects. Okay, so this is Yue. And also in southern Guangxi and eastern Guangxi, most people at least understand Cantonese. Many speak Cantonese as well, but Cantonese is the lingua franca in southern and eastern Guangxi. Okay, next, in northern Guangxi, you have these green blobs. This is Southwestern Mandarin. Southwestern Mandarin is the lingua franca in northern Guangxi, and it's spoken in the city centers of Liuzhou and Guilin. In Guangxi, southwestern Mandarin is called Guiliu Hua, as in Guilin Liu Zhou Hua. And the four tones in Guiliu Hua is da, 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 da. So Guiliu Hua is Guiliu Hua. Next, you have Hakka, which is these yellow blobs. They came from Guangdong, and the numbers have overtaken the number of Pinghua speakers. They arrived within the last few hundred years. There are many different enclaves of Hakka speakers in Guangxi, and 2 days ago we were very lucky to have a talk on Guangxi Hakka. And she was talking about Hakka from Bobai, which is here in southeastern Guangxi. And there are two other Sinitic languages in Guangxi, and one is Xiang in this northeastern corner of Guangxi, in the northern parts of Guilin Prefecture. And there are also many, many small enclaves of Southern like here and here and here. The number of Southern speakers in Guangxi is very small. Okay, so there are these 6 Sinitic languages, with Pinghua being the oldest, but in terms of number, it's not very big. Pinghua. In Guangxi, there is no standard variety of Pinghua. And Pinghua speakers form the majority only in 2 county-level entities, and they are in Hangzhou to the east of Nanning and Binyang to the northeast of Nanning. Meaning that there are Pinghua speakers in many different counties, but in most counties they are the minority. First of all, minority in relation to the native people, Zhuang. And secondly, also minority in relation to the other Sinitic speakers. Except for Binyang, all county seats and city centers in Pinghua-speaking regions are dominated by Southwestern Mandarin, Cantonese, and or Zhuang. Meaning that for a Pinghua speaker, if they, for example, sell vegetable in their own village, then they can speak Pinghua. But if they go into the city, depending on the city, they would have to speak Cantonese, or Southwestern Mandarin, or Zhuang. Just one example, in the capital Nanning, schematically, you have the Yong River flowing from the west to east. In the city center, you have Cantonese speakers who arrived within the last 150 years or so. In the surrounding suburbs, you have the Pinghua speakers who arrived about 1,000 years ago. There's actually yet another language, which is Old Nanning Mandarin, Yongzhou Guanhua, which is a type of Southwestern Mandarin. Yongzhou Guanhua, Old Nanning Mandarin, used to dominate the city center. However, with the arrival of more and more Cantonese speakers, Old Nanning Mandarin has been pushed out of the city center, and Old Nanning Mandarin is now spoken in some villages further away. And further away, you have the indigenous people speaking Northern Zhuang and Southern Zhuang. So traditionally, Zhuang people, they favored locations next to forests, next to mountains, because these locations are easier to defend. On the other hand, Mandarin and Cantonese speakers, they favor the city centers because they dominate the politics, the economy. This leaves the Pinghua speakers in the suburbs and also the nearby rural areas. Actually, these days, with the rapidly expanding cities, one thing that Pinghua speakers do is that because they have so much land in the suburbs, the Pinghua speakers nowadays, they rent out their properties. So in the olden days, Pinghua speakers, they have to speak Cantonese. But nowadays, if you want to speak to your landlord, you have to learn Pinghua. There's actually yet another language in Nanning these days, and that is a New Nanning Mandarin, or Nanning Putonghua, Nanpu. So this is Nanning's version of Standard Mandarin. The pronunciation is like Standard Mandarin, but there's a lot of influence from the local languages. So for instance, these words, they are pronounced like Standard Mandarin, but if you speak Cantonese, you'll probably understand what these mean. And there's also the Lan Shou Xianggu meme, right? Lan Shou Xianggu in Standard Mandarin is Nan Shou Xiang Ku. Nan Shou feel so bad. Xiang Ku want to cry. But in that video, you have that man speaking Mandarin, but in a Northern Zhuang accent. That type of accent is very commonly heard in Nanning. One thing about Northern Zhuang is that there are no aspirated consonants. So ku became gu. Okay, so that man he pronounced Lan Shou Xiang Gu, and that video became so popular in mainland China. Okay, so this is another feature of Nanning, that nowadays you have New Nanning Mandarin dominating Nanning. Next, I'll be talking about the difference between Northern Pinghua and Southern Pinghua. Southern Pinghua, there's relatively little variation amongst the Southern Pinghua dialects. There is a medium-high to high level of conservatism with the Middle Chinese consonantal coders. So this is similar to most Yue and Guangdong Hakka dialects. What this means is that, for example, these words, okay, in Middle Chinese, they ended in P, T, K, M, N, N, respectively. And in Yue dialects, these coders are preserved rather well. For instance, in Nanning Cantonese, Sab, Ba, Lok, Sam, Qin, Ling. Okay, the coders in this case is preserved. In Southern Pinghua, they are also preserved rather well. For example, in Nanning Weizilo Pinghua. Also, by the way, I collected these data. In Nanning, the various suburbs, there's so many different accents of Nanning Pinghua. They differ in their tones and consonants and vowels. So much so that sometimes people have to rely on speaking Nanning Cantonese to communicate with each other. But anyway, I did my field work in the suburb of Weizilo, which is to the northwest of the city center. Okay. In Nanning Weizilo Pinghua, these words, Shlap, Bat, Lop, Sham, Qin, Len, the coders of P, T, K, M, and N are preserved, not 100%, but rather well. Another example, Rongshui, Tu Guanhua, is a Southern Pinghua dialect spoken in far northern Guangxi. There they have also preserved the coders rather well. On the other hand, Northern Pinghua is very diverse. The diversity amongst the Northern Pinghua dialects is huge. The Northern Pinghua dialects are strongly Mandarinized. And most of them have lost all the plosive coders, meaning that the vast majority of them have no P, T, and K. And most of them only have the consonantal coders of N, N, or N. Another area feature is that quite often they would have lost the nasality in Iran totally. We'll see examples of this. For example, the same 6 words. In Middle Chinese, they ended in P, T, K, M, and N. But in Mandarin, for instance, in Liuzhou Mandarin, 4, 8, 6, 3, 7, 6, right? P, T, K are gone like most Mandarin dialects. And the nasality is kept, but there's only an N and also nasalized vowels. In the Pinghua, in the suburb of Chaoyang in Guilin, you can see that the P, T, K, M, and N are mostly totally lost. Here you have M becoming N, but the N is lost, N is lost in these cases. And similarly, in Hezhou, Jiuzhou, which is another Northern Pinghua dialect, you can see that the P, T, K, M, and N are totally gone. Somewhat similar to Mandarin. Northern Pinghua. So we have seen how in Northern Pinghua the consonantal coders are lost, but this loss of consonantal coders is actually somewhat recent. Because, one, although most Northern Pinghua dialects have no obstruent coders, most of them have no PTK, but there are isolated cases where they are still found. For example, in the Pinghua of Wutong, in Lingui district of Guilin, which is to the west of the city center, the 3 linguists, they have recorded some PTK coders in Wutong Pinghua. And you can see that they have, they're recording a process of these being lost, gradually turning into a glossal stop. And also, if you look at the non-Sinitic languages in the region, they have Chinese loanwords that looks like Southern Pinghua. For example, in the Chadong language, which is a Gamsui language, and Chadong town is to the southwest of Wutong, they have Chinese loanwords like diep, niep, bai, which looks very much like Nanning Pinghua, diep, niep, bai. This is not to say that these non-Sinitic languages borrowed the Chinese loanwords from Southern Pinghua. Instead, what this is saying is that they suggest that the Northern Pinghua dialects surrounding them were like Southern Pinghua not very long ago. Okay, so the loss of the consonantal coders in Northern Pinghua is quite recent. Next, I'll have to talk about migration routes in the far southern China region. Here you have the Pearl River Basin. And to the south, you have these little rivers on the coast between Macau and the Vietnamese border. And here you have the Red River flowing into Vietnam. To the north, you have first of all, you have the Yangtze River Basin, Changjiang. Further north is the Huai River, and further north is the Yellow River, Huanghe. Han Chinese people originated in the Yellow River region. And to reach far southern China, due to the terrain, they had to take specific routes. Right. Looking at this relief map, this is the Changjiang Yangtze River. And to the south, you can see that there are two big tributaries, the Xiang River and the Gang River. In the earliest days, Han Chinese people primarily took the Xiang River to reach the Pearl River Basin. In 214 BCE, the Lingqi Canal was dug, connecting the Xiang River of the Yangtze with the Pearl River system. Since then, Han Chinese people primarily took the Xiang River to reach far southern China. Most Han Chinese people settled in this region in northeastern Guangxi, around Guilin, and also around Hezhou. I call this the Hunan-Guangxi corridor. Some people went further downriver to Guangdong around the Pearl River Delta, but actually more people went down to the coast along eastern Guangxi and went further by boat to the Red River Delta. In the first millennium, in the first 1,000 years, there were more Han Chinese people in Guangxi and Vietnam than in Guangdong. Things changed in the 8th century with the opening of the Plum Pass Road, Meiguandao, which linked the Gan River to the north of Jiangxi and the Pearl River Delta, the Pearl River system. And I call this the Jiangxi Guangdong corridor. Within decades, just a few tens of years, the amount of Han Chinese migrants that went through Jiangxi Guangdong corridor was so great that the Han Chinese population in Guangdong had already surpassed that of Guangxi and Vietnam. Then later on in the 10th century, you had the first major independence of Vietnam from China. And in the 11th century, the center of development in Guangxi shifted westward towards Liuzhou and Nanning. So, looking at these two corridors, the languages, the Sinitic languages, the Sinitic dialect groups associated with the Hunan-Guangxi corridor are Xiang, Southwestern Mandarin, and Pinghua. Mandarin is a language that grew, but Xiang and Pinghua are both not very big languages, and they are shrinking languages. On the other hand, looking at the Jiangxi Guangdong corridor, you can see that the languages associated with them, Gan, Hakka, and Yue, they are much larger languages, and they are languages that expanded. In the case of Yue originated in the Pearl River Delta, and Yue gradually spread westward towards the west. And on the way, they have covered up the indigenous languages and also Pinghua. And hence, Yue is a language that keeps on growing, and Pinghua is a language that keeps on shrinking. And in terms of the Sinitic languages in Guangxi, you have Xiang, Pinghua, and Southwestern Mandarin that came from or through Hunan from the north, whereas you have Yue, Hakka, and Min that came from the east, from or via Guangdong. Next, I'll have to talk about the Pinghua-Yue dialect continuum. So, although Yue and Pinghua have different origins, Southern Pinghua and the non-Cantonese Yue dialects in Guangxi form a dialect continuum, and this continuum continues in the Guangdong. In other words, if you look at Pinghua and Yue, if you ignore the Cantonese dialects in Guangxi and also ignore Northern Pinghua, then Pinghua and Yue exist on a dialect continuum. As in the features changes very gradually. It's actually very difficult to draw where the boundary is. Now, this is possible due to a number of reasons. First of all, the linguistic input from northern China for Pinghua and Yue was not overly different, meaning that the southern Semitic languages, they formed from waves of influence from northern China, covering up the indigenous languages that existed in that existed in southern Pinghua, that is in southern China. And for Pinghua, as for Pinghua around Nanning, the two major layers, first of all, you have 8th century Middle Chinese from northern China. This is in the middle of Tang Dynasty. Another layer is 11th century late Middle Chinese from northern China, and this is in the middle of northern Song Dynasty. Back. And for Pinghua, these people, they were mainly soldiers that were sent by the central government to deal with the indigenous people, revolts by indigenous people in Guangxi, and also to secure the border, like to the south with Dayet and to the east, to the west with Dali. Okay, so the people who brought the Chinese language into Guangxi were mostly soldiers, and they don't number a whole lot, as in the number is not very big. On the other hand, with Yue around the Pearl River Delta, the two major layers are 9th, 10th century Middle Chinese from northern China. So this is the end of the Tang Dynasty, and also the 5 Dynasties period. And also 13th century early Mandarin. This is the end of Song Dynasty. The situation with Yue is different because Yue was brought in mostly by civilians, by huge groups of refugees fleeing northern China, fleeing wars at the end of Tang Dynasty, at the end of southern Song Dynasty. Okay, so you have these various waves of northern Chinese. But actually, honestly, if you look at like 10th century Middle Chinese and 11th century Middle Chinese, they are not overly different. Okay, so the linguistic input, northern Chinese linguistic input for Pinghua and Yue are not overly different to start off with. There are some difference, but not very, very different. Another thing is that as Han Chinese people arrived in far southern China, they encountered the indigenous people, and most of them spoke Gradai languages, meaning that the indigenous influence that you have in Pinghua and Yue are actually rather similar. Okay, so this makes Pinghua and Yue look rather similar. And even in Standard Cantonese, which is nowadays spoken very far away from the Dai languages, like Zhuang, for instance, but even in Standard Cantonese, you still see quite many language features that are similar to the Dai languages. A third factor is that Guangzhou in the east is the primary center of linguistic influence. As one heads towards the west, the Cantonese-like influences become gradually weaker and weaker, and the Pinghua-like features become gradually more and more common. Okay, so you have a gradation of difference as you travel from east to west. So this created a dialect continuum. Next, I'll be showing you some differences along this Pinghua Yue dialect continuum in the Pearl River Basin. Right. I have many features that I could show you, but obviously I have a limited amount of time, so I'll show you a very small number of them. But before I do that, there are some caveats. First of all, I'll be calling some Western features and some Eastern features, but you have to keep in mind that a Western feature is simply a feature that is more common in the West. You can sometimes find some of these Western features in the East as well, to a small degree. And the same can be said of the Eastern features. Eastern features are only features that are more common in the East. You sometimes see them in the West as well, to a small degree. And also that the speech variety, that a speech variety is labeled Pinghua or Yue does not predict whether it will have an Eastern or West feature, because sometimes the Western Yue dialects, they resemble Pinghua more than it does with the other Yue dialects. And similarly, the more easterly Pinghua dialects, sometimes they resemble Yue more than they would the other Pinghua dialects. Okay? And that the Cantonese varieties in Guangxi are ignored by default, unless they are somehow noteworthy. Because these Cantonese varieties of Guangxi, they only moved to Guangxi very recently. So these are people who move directly from the east to the west. But however, sometimes they have acquired some Western features after they have arrived in Guangxi. So I'll talk only about two phonological features. The first is what happened to the Middle Chinese voiced plosives and affricates. This is a favorite topic of Chinese dialectologists. So what happened in early Middle Chinese is that there was a three-way voiced onset time distinction for the plosives and affricates. So these are IPA, okay, these are not pinyin. Okay? So in early Middle Chinese, there was a distinction between b, p, b. There was a distinction between d, t, d, d, t, d, etc. And because modern day Mandarin, you only have a distinction between b, p. Back to early Middle Chinese. So what happened in most Chinese dialects is that the voice series have become voiceless. They have disappeared. The question is whether they have become voiceless aspirated or voiceless unaspirated. In other words, has b become b or has b become p? Different Chinese dialects vary. If you look at the Hunan Guangxi corridor, they have either remained voiced or they have become voiceless unaspirated. For instance, with the more southern Xiang dialects, quite often they have remained voiced. And this also occurs to a very, very small isolated degree with some of the Yue dialects. Whereas what happened more usually is that, for instance, in the northern Xiang dialects and also in Pinghua dialects, they have become unaspirated. Another thing is that you have these Yue dialects, and we call them the Golu Yue dialects. Okay, this is primarily within the Pearl River Basin, and they are also unaspirated. I'll show you examples afterwards. Whereas in the east, in the Jiangxi Guangdong corridor, for instance, primarily in Gan and Hakka, they have become voiceless and aspirated. I'll show you examples later on. What happens in Cantonese and some of these coastal Yue dialects in Guangdong is that you have what looks like a mixed pattern. In that, in Cantonese, they are the aspirated in tones AB and unaspirated in tones CD. This looks like a mixed pattern between the Western pattern and the Eastern pattern, but however, this pattern actually comes from Mandarin. Okay, we'll have a look at examples now. These are some examples with unaspirated initials. I'll just read out this column from Nanning Pinghua first of all. And these words in early Mandarin, in early Middle Chinese, they have voiced obstruent initials, but the g, and I've organized them in tones A, B, C, and D. In the West, for example, in Nanning Pinghua, they are all unaspirated. Tam, ben, din, ben, guang, gan, bin, din, ben, bek, tak, gap. Okay, they are all unaspirated. And similar is Hanyuan, Sino-Vietnamese. So in Vietnamese, we have various layers of Chinese loan words, but here I'm only talking about the main layer. The main layer that came from late Middle Chinese. Dam, bing, dien, bing, guang, gan, dien, bing, bạch, bạch, cập. Right? They're all unaspirated. But because the Chinese influence in Vietnam primarily came through Guangxi and Hunan. So in Vietnamese, they have the same trait. Oh, except that in Vietnamese, you also have a sound change from but the into implosive but the. And Guangning Yue, Guangning is very close to Guangzhou. Guangning is only about 130 km to the west of Guangzhou. And very similarly, they also have all of these unaspirated. In Hezhou, Jiudusheng is northern Pinghua, and here you have two examples of Xiang dialects. The Changsha Xiang, they also have voices unaspirated, primarily. And Quanzhou Xiang, this Quanzhou is in Guangxi, and they have preserved most of the voiced initials. On the other hand, in the east, in Jiangxi Guangdong corridor, Hakka is an example where they are all aspirated. So the same words, Tam Piang Tian Ping Kong, Kyun Pian, Tian Piang, Pak Tak Kip. Okay, they're all aspirated. Pak Tak Kip. So this is a feature of Jiangxi Guangdong corridor. And Cantonese. Cantonese is aspirated in tones AB and unaspirated in tones CD. Tam Peng Tin Peng Huang, Kan Bin, Din Bang, Bak Tak Kap. And in Cantonese, okay, I've shown you that in tones AB, they are aspirated, tam, kan. And in tone CD, they are unaspirated, din, ba. Now this cup is irregular, okay, ignore that. And in Cantonese, you also have the Mandarin phenomena of tone B becoming tone C to a small degree. And in Mandarin, 弹平田平狂进变颠定白达直. People sense that Mandarin is aspirated in tone A and unaspirated in tones B, C, and D. However, this is actually not entirely correct. In Mandarin, you have these lower B syllables becoming tone C. However, in Mandarin, you actually have a very, very, very small number of such tone B syllables still in tone B. For example, 勉强, to force someone to do something, 强. For instance, 窈窕淑女, 窈窕 is another example. Another example, 艇, a small boat, 艇. Right. Notice that these tone B syllables in Mandarin, they're also aspirated. Right. So what happens in Mandarin instead is that in Mandarin is aspirated in tones AB and unaspirated in tone CD, exactly like Cantonese, because Cantonese got this trait from early Mandarin. Right? Okay, in summary, a Western feature is that these voiced obstruents in Middle Chinese, they are unaspirated, whereas the Eastern feature is that they are more aspiration in the East. And with Yue dialects, we know that the unaspirated Western feature is older, because even in the Pearl River Delta, you have remnants of this unaspirated trait. And there's no indication that they were influenced by the Golo Yue dialects. For example, let me think, in Shunde, for instance, to the south of Guangzhou, in Shunde, they have the Cantonese pattern. However, there's some remnants of the older unaspirated pattern with some of the most commonly used words. For example, the word meaning sweet, Mandarin tian, Cantonese tim. In Shunde, it is dim, very sweet, ho dim. Another example, old woman, Mandarin po, Cantonese paw. In Shunde, it is bo, a grandmother. And tone B, the word for no taste, the word for blend, Mandarin ban, Cantonese tam. In Shunde is tam, unaspirated. Okay, so the unaspirated pattern is actually older with Yue dialects. Next, I'll be talking about the splitting of tone D. The tone D, 入声, most usually means tone that syllables with plosive coders have. Plosive coders, for example, PT and K. What happens in most Yue dialects is that there is a split of at least one of the tone Ds based on vowel length or some other vowel quality difference. So this is a trait from the Bai and Gamsui languages. For example, in Cantonese, sub, these two words, sub versus sab. Sub has a short vowel and hence it is in a higher tone. Sab has a long vowel, ah, and hence it is in a mid-level tone, so they have different tones. On average, the short vowels in Cantonese comes from vowels in early Middle Chinese, which are on average higher in tone height. And the long vowels in Cantonese come from vowels in Middle Chinese that are on average lower in tone height. Sub short vowel have a high tone and sab long vowel in a low tone. The opposite occurs only very, very rarely. For example, with long vowel, it can occasionally go in a higher tone, like bit, zit, ha, but they are very, very rare. And the opposite, namely, a short vowel going in the mid-level tone is nearly impossible. You can have sub, but you cannot really have sub. Okay, it's even very difficult to say. On the other hand, the lower tone D is not split further. Sub, sab, they have the same tone. Another example is Yulin Yue, Yulin in Guangxi. They split both the upper tone D and lower tone D based on vowel length. As for Pinghua, you have the more easterly Pinghua more easterly Pinghua dialects that do exactly the same thing. that they split the tone D based on vowel length. Two examples. One is Liu Jiaohua of Sanjiang. Sanjiang is a southern Pinghua dialect in the far north. Another example, Pinghua of Baihe in Hangzhou, to the east of Nanning. They also split the tone D based on vowel length. So this is an eastern feature. On the other hand, to the west, Pinghua spoken in Nanning and further west, they do a different thing. They do not split the tone D based on vowel length. They split the tone D, the lower tone D, based on the sonority of the initial in late Middle Chinese. For example, these two words, in Cantonese, they are pronounced with exactly the same tone, wait, wood. But in Nanning Pinghua, they have different tones. Because in Middle Chinese, the initials are different. One is sonorant and one is obstruent. Because if you pronounce these in Mandarin, yu, huo, yu, right, yin, it begins with a sonorant. Huo, it begins with an obstruent. In Mandarin, you also have these two in different tones. And in Nanning Pinghua, they are in different tones because of the sonority of the initial in Middle Chinese. What, they're in different tones. These contrast with the upper tone D, which is yet in a different tone. What. So this is a minimal set in Nanning Weizi Pinghua. Okay, so I have a lot more that I can talk about phonology, but I'll stop here with phonology and we'll move on. We'll have a look at some lexical differences now. This map is talking about the word for nose. The word for nose in Chinese dialects. In Chinese dialects, there are two versions. There's one which is in tone C, and there's one which is in tone D. The red dots are tone C, right? Standard Cantonese has Bei and tone C. Tone C is also found in Min dialects, for instance, in southern Min, Ping, in Hakka, and also in some of the southern Xiang dialects, they have the word for nose in tone C. On the other hand, in Pinghua and also in some of the more westerly dialects, they have the word for nose in tone D. For example, in Nanning Pinghua, Ba Ji, nose, Ba. Okay, it has a coda, T in it, tone D, obstruent coda, Ba. And Hepu Yue, Hepu is about here, Pat Lang, Pat. Okay? It also has a T in it, different from Cantonese, which does not have a T. This dot is Yulin Yue. Okay? Yulin Yue, the word for nose, Bat Bi Gong, has both a tone D and a tone C in it combined. Bat is tone D, Bi is tone C. So I've been talking about in Standard Cantonese, the word for nose is in tone C, but actually there is a fossilized form of tone D as well. For instance, this thing, a guidak, right? This thing in Standard Cantonese is called a zheng bat pong. Zheng bat pong is commonly written as elephant pull clam, but actually this bat is not pull. This bat is a nose, elephant nose clam, because this thing looks like an elephant trunk. Okay? Elephant nose clam, zheng bat pong, where bat is in tone D. And Mandarin Bi also came from tone D, because if it is tone C, it would be B. But in Mandarin, it is B, tone D. Another example of such east-west difference is the copula, verb to be, because amongst Chinese dialects, there are two different copulas. One is the one that you found in Cantonese, xi. So these red dots, these are areas where people use xi. Also, by the way, these maps, these came from Linguistic Atlas of Chinese Dialects. In Cantonese, you use hai. For example, 我係廣府人. I am a Cantonese person. 我係廣府人. Hakka also uses xi, he. 捱係客家人. I am a Hakka person. 捱係客家人. 捱係客家人. On the other hand, in the West, people use shi instead. Including Pinghua and also many westerly Yue dialects, they use shi, not si, shi. Here we have three examples of Yue dialects using shi. For instance, in Yulin, about here, Guigang, about here, and Hepu, about here. Nanning Weizi Pinghua, 是哪里本湾人? I am a Pinghua person. 我是本马人. Right? Pinghua uses 是, not 是. 临桂武通 Pinghua, around Guilin, they also use 是. All Pinghua dialects use 是. So this is another East-West difference. In the West, people use 是. In the East, people use 是. And some grammar differences. This is actually not an East-West difference, but I'll talk about this anyway. Here I'm talking about the third-person singular pronoun, he, she. The red dots. Very common amongst Southern Sinitic dialects is that they use 取 as the third-person singular pronoun. 取 either in its original tone A or it has turned into tone B. But why has it turned into tone B? The reason is that the other two pronouns, I and you, 我, 你, because these two pronouns, they're in tone B, sometimes the third-person pronoun is also inflected. It's also become tone B. Examples, in Standard Cantonese, you have 佢, he, she is 佢 in tone B. 中山粤, Zhongshan is here in between Macau and Guangzhou. 中山粤, the language of my mother's parents. They use 佢 in the original tone A. Nanning Cantonese, 佢 tone B. In Pinghua, the vast majority of Pinghua, they also use 取 as the third-person singular pronoun. Nanning 位子 Pinghua 给. This 取 pronoun is very common amongst Southern Sinitic languages. For instance, in Yue and most Pinghua, in the inland Min dialect, in Hakka, in most Wu, in Hui, in Gan, and some of the more southerly Xiang dialects. Min is different, Min is yi. But coastal Min is different. Coastal Min is yi. And this 取 in Middle Chinese came from qi in Old Chinese, okay? Because qi in Old Chinese was the possessive pronoun, third-person singular possessive pronoun. However, in Northern Guangxi, meaning the Northern Pinghua dialects and also the Southern Pinghua dialects in the north, under the influence of Southwestern Mandarin, they use 他 instead. 临桂武通 他. Compare that with Liuzhou Mandarin 他. Another thing that I want to talk about with the pronouns is the first-person plural pronoun, because the Southern Pinghua dialects in the south, they have a exclusivity distinction, meaning that these dialects, they have a distinction between we, not including you, versus we, including you. For example, in Nanning Weizulu Pinghua, 我 is first-person singular, 我對 is exclusive, 我對 is we, not including you. 運對 is we, including you. So these guys, they're singing, okay? They say what? 我對最安心. We are most happy. So they're singing that, I don't know about you, but at least we, not including you, we are very happy. Another example, Binyang Xinqiao Pinghua to the Binyang to the northeast of Nanning, they also have a distinction between 外度 and 文度, where 文度 is the inclusive pronoun and 外度 is the exclusive pronoun. On the other hand, if you go just slightly further to the east, you start to have the Yue dialects, and the Yue dialects, they do not have exclusivity distinction. For instance, in Guigang, just to the east of Binyang, you have the plural pronoun 农队, okay, and 农队 has no exclusivity distinction. It's just we. So in Guigang, you see that they also use the suffix 队, which means like team, like Pinghua, but in Guigang, there's no exclusivity distinction. And similarly, to the south on the coast, you have Hebu Yue. Yue, in Hebu Yue, you have one, which means first person plural, and again, with no exclusivity distinction. And another interesting thing is that they also use this morpheme one, like Pinghua. And this word one probably came from Northern Zhuang, one, which means people. So this is probably the only isogloss that actually separates Yue and Pinghua. However, the Southern Pinghua dialects in the north and Northern Pinghua, again, have no plosives distinction, presumably under the influence of Southwestern Mandarin. Right, the last grammar point that I'll talk about are the negators. And it's quite complex. I'll have to start with Mandarin. In Mandarin, you have a distinction between bu and mei or meiyou. There have been so many papers, so many PhD theses talking about the distinction about bu and meiyou, and people are still arguing over this. Just one example is Xiao and McInerney says that bu in Mandarin negates the existence of a state, and mei negates the realization of an event. For example, actually, here in an oversimplified way, I'll call bu imperfective negation and mei perfective negation. For example, 我不去, I am not going, imperfective. 我没去, I did not go, perfective. Another thing you have to notice is that negative existence or possession always uses 没 and not 不. So 我没钱, I have no money. Right? No matter whether you have no money in the past or present or future, it is always 我没钱, not 我不钱. 我没钱. You use the perfective one. Standard Cantonese is very similar with a distinction between and 冇. 我唔去, I am not going. Imperfective. 我冇去, I did not go. Perfective. And similarly, with a negative possession, you use 冇. 我冇錢, I have no money. A single syllable 冇 means not have. Okay, you say 我冇錢, not 我唔錢. You have to say 我冇錢, the perfective one. However, slightly to the west, there is an isogloss, where in Western Guangdong and in Guangxi, there's no longer a distinction between and mo. Everything is mao. For example, in Huazhou Yue, Huazhou is about here in southwestern Guangdong. In Huazhou Yue, you will say, I, Mao, go to school. I am not going to school. I, yesterday, Mao, go to school. I did not go to school yesterday. Okay, so there's no distinction between and mo. And similarly, to say not have, you would say Mao. I, Mao, have. I, Mao, this book. I do not have this book. Right? So it's very stereotypical of people from Western Guangdong that they say Mao for everything. A little bit to the west, there is another isogloss, where to say not have, you no longer can use a single syllable. You have to say separately not have with a negator plus the verb to have itself, actually. For instance, in Nanning Weizi Pinghua, you would have to say 我没有钱. I have no money. You have to say 没有, not have, 2 syllables. And another thing to point out in this map is that these yellow rain dots, including Nanning Weizi Pinghua, this is the area where people use me as a negator, and me comes from Thai languages. Nanning Cantonese. Okay, they came from the east. However, after they have arrived in the west, they have also acquired the western pattern. So we can contrast Standard Cantonese in the east versus Nanning Cantonese in the west. In Standard Cantonese, there is a distinction between and mo. 我唔去, I'm not going, versus 我冇去, I did not go. 我不去, 我没去. But in Nanning Cantonese, both of these are 冇. 我冇去, I did not go, I am not going. And in Standard Cantonese in the east, you will say 我冇錢, I have no money. 冇, single syllable means not have. But in Nanning Cantonese, you will say 2 syllables. 我冇有錢, I have no money. And here are just some examples of of 4 Chinese dialects in Guangxi that also have exactly the same pattern. Beihai Cantonese on the coast, Hepu Yue also on the coast, Guigang Yue to the east of Nanning, and Lingui Wutong Pinghua, northern Pinghua. By northern Pinghua, this mo ta, not have, is an irregular negative form of yao, to have. And this irregularity is a feature that is very common with for example, the Xiang dialects to the north. So this is an influence from Hunan. So this Western analytic pattern of Mo plus Yao is also found in Standard Cantonese in the East as late as the 19th century. So this is a very new innovation from Standard Cantonese. So the analytic pattern of Mo versus Yao in the West is a retention of the older pattern. And in the West, it is also supported by the indigenous languages having exactly the same pattern. For example, in Northern Zhuang, Go Bu Bai, I did not go, I am not going. Bong is a single negator. There's no Bu versus Mei distinction. Go Bo Mi Ngan, I have no money. Bo Mi, not have. Right? You need two separate syllables. The same pattern is found in the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of Thai languages as well. For instance, in Thai, you would say, "ผมไม่ไป," I am not going, I do not go. ผมไม่มีเงิน I have no money. ไม่มี not have. Okay, so this is the last grammar point that I'll be talking about. And next, I'll be talking about the opinions, the range of opinions on the affiliation of Pinghua in China. Just to recap, is that Pinghua and Yue have different but similar origins. And Northern Pinghua is Pinghua that has been Mandarinized. Southern Pinghua and the non-Cantonese Yue dialects in Guangxi form a dialect continuum. So given that this is a dialect continuum, then whether Pinghua and Yue are one or two entities, and if they are two, where the boundary between them lies, actually just depends on one's perspective. Especially given that in Chinese dialectology, you use both retentive and innovative features for dialect classification. Then in that case, you can basically say whatever you want. The arguments over whether Pinghua and Yue are one or two is very similar to another never-ending argument in Chinese linguistics, and that is over whether Gan and Hakka are one or two dialect groups, because similarly with Gan and Hakka, you have never-ending arguments, with people saying that Gan and Hakka are one or two dialect groups. Now, there are four broad types of opinions in relation to Pinghua versus Yue. Opinion number one is that Golo Yue is Pinghua. Okay, so these are the Golo Yue dialects. So these are the Western Yue dialects usually within the Pearl Basin. So there's Li Lianjin and Li Xiaodan who says that Golo Yue is Pinghua as well. Further, Li Lianjin 2005 argues that the Tuhua of southern Hunan and northern Guangdong are Pinghua as well. I'll be talking a very little bit about Tuhua afterwards. Now, given that the Golo Yue dialects are literally in between the Pinghua in the west and Cantonese in the east, so whether you say Golo Yue is Pinghua or whether it is Yue, it kind of just depends on your perspective. Opinion number two is that it's the traditional division between Pinghua and Yue, that Pinghua is Pinghua and Yue is Yue. This is the position in the Language Atlas of China, both the first and second edition. And the first edition of the Language Atlas of China, they follow the opinion of Zhang Junru, 1982. What Zhang Junru said was that she looked into the Chinese loanwords in Zhuang and compared them with Pinghua and Cantonese. She concluded that the Chinese loanwords in Pinghua, Chinese loanwords in Zhuang came from Pinghua and not Cantonese. And because Cantonese is Yue, then Pinghua is not Yue. Okay, so this is a reason to say that Pinghua is not Yue. However, notice that this is actually a fallacy. It's logically wrong because that Cantonese is Yue does not infer whether Pinghua is Yue or not. People with similar views as Zhang Junru include Liang Mian and Wei Shuguan. This division between Pinghua and Yue is congruent with people's legends about where their ancestors come from, because Pinghua speakers, they are quite proud of their northern Chinese ancestry, and they say that they came through Hunan, whereas the Yue people, Yue speakers in Guangxi, they say that their ancestors come from Guangdong to the east. However, if you look at the dialects around the around the border, both sides of the border, they're actually not far too different from each other on both sides of the border. So this is a dialect continuum. Again, the question of where the boundary lies is very difficult. Another thing worth noting is that the term Yue itself, in Guangxi, the term Yue is strongly associated with Guangdong. Because Pinghua is not from Guangdong, most people in Guangxi do not like that you call Pinghua as Yue. Okay, so there are quite a lot of people in Guangxi who does not like Yue being subsumed under Yue. Next is opinion number 3. Opinion number 3 is that Southern Pinghua is Yue, and Northern Pinghua is something else. Now, this is actually the majority opinion in mainland China these days. Okay, these are some examples, and there are many more. Now, given the very lumpist approach of dialect classification that you have in China, it is unsurprising that people want to subsume Pinghua back into Yue. And outside of mainland China, there have been a number of reconstructions of Proto-Yue that also included at least some Southern Pinghua dialects as Yue. Examples are Yu Hashimoto, 2006, Karen Huang, 2009, Hamada Takeshi, and also Giorgio Orlandi, 2020. They have all included some Southern Pinghua dialects for the reconstruction of Proto-Yue. As for what Northern Pinghua is, some people say that they are not Yue, they are Northern Pinghua, and other people say that I don't know what they are, they're just not Yue. And the fourth opinion is that all Pinghua is Yue, and these are some examples. And other than these 4 types of opinions, there are also some opinions that are more agnostic, or in other words, not so committed. An example is Gan Yuan and Wu Fang, 2005. For them, Pinghua is not Yue, but Pinghua at the same time is also not a first-order dialect group. In other words, okay, Pinghua is not Yue, but Pinghua is also not on par. It's also something that is not on par with a group like Yue. For me, this position is quite uncommitted, but okay, fine, whatever you want. The interesting thing is that they have also raised Lao Zhenfa's metaphor. And my rendition of it is that arguing over whether Pinghua is a branch of Yue or not, it's like a fisher arguing over whether seawater is cyan or blue. Right? It just simply depends on your perspective. Seawater is just seawater. If you want, you can say that it is cyan, because from some point of view, it is cyan. If you want to say that it is blue, okay, fine, you can call it blue, because from some perspective, it is blue. And in terms of dialect classification, it is very important for you to not have a preconceived notion of how many categories there are. And also, it is very important for you to not have a preconceived notion of what the prototypes or canons are for these categories. In other words, discussing whether Pinghua is Yue or not is, I wouldn't say useless, but it's a never-ending question. Okay, the very last thing that I have to talk about is people's opinion on Northern Pinghua. I myself, I have to concentrate on Southern Pinghua, so I haven't done a lot of research on Northern Pinghua. But I'll tell you a little bit about people's opinions on Northern Pinghua now. And to talk about Northern Pinghua, you have to talk a little bit about Tuhua. Here, this is a map of the Sinitic languages of Guangdong to the east of Guangxi, in Guangdong. In Guangdong, you have the big categories of Yue, Hakka, and Min. And these are the non-Sinitic languages, primarily drawn in Mian. However, the editors of this map, when they look at Northern Guangdong, they have these unclassified Chinese dialects, which they didn't know what to do with. So they just simply call them Tuhua, and they will deal with them in the future, sometime in the future. To the north, similarly, you have the map of Jiangxi and Hunan. In Jiangxi and Hunan, you have the big categories of Gan, Hakka, Xiang, and Mandarin. And then also the small languages of Xianghua or Huaxiang, and also Wu and Hui here. And as for southern Hunan, they have encountered this area, which is bilingual in southwestern Mandarin, and also these unclassified Chinese dialects, which they didn't know what to do with. Okay, so they simply call them Tuhua and leave them for the future. Tuhua. What happened in Guangxi is that in northeastern Guangxi, they have encountered all these Chinese dialects. Okay? Some of them are more closely related to southern Pinghua. However, there are all these other dialects which they didn't know what to do with, and they simply call all of these Pinghua. And the second edition of the Language of China, they have continued with this nomenclature of Pinghua and Tuhua, where they have one map for Pinghua and Tuhua. But it is a little bit suspicious that that you have a provincial boundary. On one side, things are called Pinghua, and the other side, things are called Tuhua. And it is a bit suspicious as to how different they are across the provincial boundary. The answer is that they are not very different. Looking at northeastern Guangxi, if you ask a linguist from Guangxi, some of them will tell you that all of these are Pinghua, but most of them will tell you that they are actually, roughly speaking, three different groups. The first group is the core area around Guilin. These are unquestionably northern Pinghua because they look just like southern Pinghua but Mandarinized. In the east, you have these dialects, these non-Mandarin, non-Yuan, non-Hakka, non-Min dialects in Hezhou Prefecture, which are sometimes considered Pinghua but sometimes not considered Pinghua by these Guangxi linguists. Another peripheral area is this northern area in northern Guilin Prefecture. Something that is not shown in this map is that in this area there are actually some non-Mandarin, non-Xiang dialects in this area. And these dialects are sometimes considered Pinghua and sometimes not considered Pinghua by these Guangxi linguists. Okay, just to recap, there is a core area of northern Pinghua and two peripheral areas where the dialects are not necessarily considered Pinghua by Guangxi linguists. Some examples: Chen Hailun and Liu Cunhan, 2009. This book, okay, which came from the series of Guangxi University linguistics book series. They use three terms. The first term is Guibei Pinghua, northern Guangxi Pinghua. So this is talking about the core area around Guilin. Next term is Guibei Tuhua, northern Guangxi Tuhua. This is the dialects in the northern area, where most people speak Xiang. Another term is Guidong Tuhua, eastern Guangxi Tuhua. Okay, these are the dialects in the east in Hezhou Prefecture. So they use three terms. Presumably, they only consider the core area Pinghua. And with exactly the same group of linguists in Guangxi University, there is Yu Jin, 2007. In her survey of Pinghua, she does not include the eastern dialects, meaning that she considers the core area and the northern area Pinghua, but not the eastern area. And her colleague Lin Ye, 2016, quoting her ex-student Liu Zhihua, 2008, Liu Zhihua, based on lexical data from 11 of these dialects in northeastern Guangxi, she has constructed a distance matrix and also a tree for these 11 dialects. And the result is that there is a core Guilin cluster, an eastern Hezhou cluster, and a northern cluster. And for Lin Yi, she considers the core area and the eastern area Pinghua, and the northern cluster for her is not Pinghua. As you can see, the distance between each of the northern dialects are already larger than the distance between the eastern and the core cluster. So in this slide, I've shown you that the Guangxi linguists, they have a core area which is unquestionably northern Pinghua, and two periphery areas which they may or may not consider Pinghua. And very lastly, these Tuhua, by definition, they are unclassified. And from time to time, there are proposals of reclassification of them into the other primary Sinitic dialect groups. Here I'll only tell you one of them. And that is that the so-called 本地话 or 梧州话 in Pingle, Zhongshan, Fuchuan, and also in Jianghua County in Hunan. These dialects, by the way, this boundary is only a rough boundary drawn by me, okay? These dialects are actually Yue dialects. These are Yue dialects that have been recently Mandarinized. Okay? Because, Yue dialects and Pinghua, they are already quite similar to start off with. If you have a Yue dialect that is Mandarinized, then it is going to look like Northern Pinghua, and that's why these dialects were considered Northern Pinghua. But according to these people, and especially Qimian is very convincing, that these dialects are actually Yue dialects that have been recently Mandarinized. So this leaves these dialects further east in Hezhou. In Hezhou, you have these 九多话, 八多话, 七多话, these 都话preceded by numeral. These dialects, the speakers came from Hunan, southern Hunan. And as for the northern dialects, these northern non-Xiang, non-Mandarin dialects, they're related to the Tuohua spoken in Dong'an in Hunan. Dong'an is the northernmost county in Hunan where the Tuohua is spoken. So this leaves only this area. So personally, I would consider only this area around Guilin as Northern Pinghua. However, this is only my personal opinion because I have to concentrate on Southern Pinghua. I haven't yet done a lot of research on Northern Pinghua, but my opinion is that I would want to call only these dialects around Guilin as Northern Pinghua and not the other peripheral areas. Okay, so this is all I have to tell you. An acknowledgement and 多謝，不是的。And in Nanning Pinghua, I would say 請多多係意見。In Nanning Cantonese, I would say 請多多雞意見. Please give a lot of comments. Thank you. Hello. Thank you. I've just seen your opinions. Hello, Alina.
Great. Hello. It was, the presentation after which one you don't have any questions because all of them were answered already. Great, actually, presentation. A lot of things I have never heard of. And I read some of the books that you mentioned, but my focus wasn't on Pinghua. And so many different approaches to this this region. It's so interesting. And we have some questions in chat box. Just please don't forget to answer them.
Okay, I'll read them. Samson says, is Hezhou Jiudou Pinghua linguistically Pinghua? I myself, I say no. We're looking at the Tuohua area, okay? It is a huge area of transition of linguistic features from the neighboring groups, namely Pinghua, Xiang, Gan, Hakka, Yue, and also the Mandarin in between. So Hezhou Jiudou Sheng, obviously, it will have some features that look like Pinghua, but I myself personally, I wouldn't call it Pinghua. But, well, that it is spoken in Guangxi, and some linguists will call it Pinghua. Yes, and Lin 先生说的就是 do Southern and Northern Pinghua differ a lot in terms of vocabulary? Yes and no. In the core area, no. Okay. There are some very common Guangxi words, like in Cantonese you have walk, Mandarin guo, but in Pinghua you tend to say cheng. Can I type this? Cheng. One type that for me, but anyway, the word for in Guangxi you tend to have word for cheng. And there are many of these Guangxi words which are very similar between Nanning and Guilin area, although in Guilin these pronunciations are Mandarinized. However, lexically, in the peripheral areas, they are very different. And Samson says, you also mentioned Hezhou Jiudou Tuohua, so I thought it is a distinct variety of Hezhou Jiudou Pinghua. Oh, sorry, Hezhou Jiudou Sheng is exactly the same thing. They're not different. Yes. Maria Ozolina says, D. Hilário de Sousa, your research is of enormous volume. Thank you so much for the profound lecture. My questions are, what is your native dialect? I speak Cantonese natively. And where and what aspects of linguistics do you teach? Who is your audience? Excuse me if I might have missed it out at the start. Thank you. Currently I am unemployed. I'm looking for a job. But I did this research some years ago when I was a postdoc in Paris, and I did fieldwork in Nanning, looking at Nanning Pinghua. And one important question is what I have presented to you is, what is Pinghua? Have I answered your questions? Are there any other further questions?
Oh yeah, typing. Just wait a moment because
Okay.
it's not so immediate. But my dear attendees, you can type share audio and video and just use your voice to ask questions. It's open for everyone. You can, if you are too shy, you can close your camera and don't show us. You just use your voice. That will be enough. And we have another question in chat box.
Samson Lee, I noticed in your Sino-Vietnamese data that Yang Xu and Yang Shang have the same modern reflex. Is it the Vietnamese Nang tone? Would this be an evidence that this Sino-Viet layer is after Yang Shang Hui Qu, or is it an independent development in Vietnamese? Both yes and no. The phenomenon of Yang Shang Hui Qu, meaning lower tone B going into lower tone C, also occurs to some degree in Sino-Vietnamese. But its level is similar to Cantonese, actually, that you have maybe around 50% of them going from lower tone B to lower tone C. It just so happens that I've shown you very few examples of tone B and tone C syllables, and they all happen to all have tone C. And is it the Nang tone? Does it happen to native Viet words too? No, I don't think so. So I have been working with John Fan, and his theory was that there used to be a native variety of Sinitic spoken in the Red River Delta. And later on, after the independence of Vietnam, the Sinitic speakers in Vietnam and the indigenous speakers, Viet Minh speakers in Vietnam, they merged into one language. Okay, so this phenomenon that you're talking about of tone B becoming tone C, presumably this only happened with the Sinitic speakers in Vietnam. Okay, so this phenomenon, I don't think it happens with native Vietnamese. Okay, according to your previous answer, do you consider that the Mandarinization of Northern Pinghua only happened on a phonological level and did not have a huge impact on vocabulary? Again, yes and no. That, for example, they have already used the Mandarin pronoun ta instead of chu. So it is a bit of half-half in this case. But they have some vocabulary impact as well from Mandarin. And you also see, for instance, the kinship terms that have been Mandarinized quite a bit in Northern Pinghua. So half-half, I would say. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, I myself, I haven't done a lot of research on Northern Pinghua, and I can only answer you to a degree.
Well, we hope that you will finish your book, that we can...
Yeah, on Southern Pinghua.
Yes, that will be great. And then you will start your research on other parts of Pinghua. Some of our listeners has already checked the information that it will be published next year, right?
There is a date, but I'll try very hard.
Okay. We wish you all good luck and thank you very much. It was, really so much new information today for all of us. And we do hope that we will publish your book as soon as possible.
Yes.
So if you need any help to promote it, any help to tell others, just write to us. We will be very happy to tell everyone who attended this festival about your book, so they can read more about Pinghua. It's not very usual that you have this information. So if no one has any other questions, so I'm giving you some time to type them. Yes, Professor, wish you all luck and all time. And about the job, perhaps others who will listen and watch this recording today and tomorrow, they will consider you a very valuable member of staff. And I will recommend if you want to move to Russia, because it's so interesting. Really, so many things that you can find in this. Well, I think it's not very well researched area, Guangxi, because of the difficulties, because of the. It's not Guangdong, it's not Fujian.
Yeah, relative lack of money.
Yes, lack of money. Well, I met some of the Guangxi people and Guizhou people, and they told me that, we don't have a lot of money, but probably it's for the best, because we have the best ecology in China. Ecology situation, probably it's for the best that we don't have too much money. So I do hope that because of a lack of the money, they do preserve their language better. And the fact that you told that today the Pinghua owners of the land, they are considered wealth people, right?
They're becoming rich.
Becoming rich. So the Pinghua is becoming popular. That's good. It's an opportunity for the language, I think.
Yes, in terms of promotion, there has been more promotions of Pinghua these days. But for example, looking at online videos.
Do you have anything in mind, some websites or some resources to watch and to listen?
No, just looking at Chinese video websites, there are some videos on Pinghua, not a lot. Most videos coming out of Nanning is in New Nanning Mandarin or Nanning Cantonese. There are some videos from Zhuang, but there are not many videos from Pinghua, but there are some. I'm seeing a bit more these days. And there are more festivals promoting, for instance, Nanning songs, Shanke, and also Nanning opera, Pinghua opera. Yeah, there are more promotions these days.
That's great. Yeah. Well, we do hope that it will continue.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, and I do hope to see your book sooner and to listen more to your lectures, because it was incredibly interesting today. Thank you very much, and thank our audience who were listening from the beginning till the very end for more than an hour. You're great guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. See you tomorrow. Don't forget, tomorrow is the last day of the festival, and there will be many interesting topics, starting from Marjorie Chen in the morning, according to Moscow time. So you can watch her video starting from 8 a.m. Moscow time. It will be 1 or 2 p.m. in Beijing time, as far as I remember.
And also Maria's talk.
Yes, and then she will be present, and then others will be present, and I do hope that every one of you will be present too. Yes, if you haven't been watching from the very beginning, you will see in 10 minutes time in replay section this marvelous lecture. Thank you very much again, and see you probably tomorrow.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.